All right, we are back here to talk about James Madison's presidency and the War of 1812. So let's jump right in. So here we are, we've just experienced the Louisiana Purchase, we sent out and explored a bunch of stuff out there, and so now Americans want to start moving into that territory out there, and so they begin to settle in what was now known as the Indian Territory. Now, Tecumseh, Native American, and his other fellow Native Americans did not like this. Tecumseh was the leader of the Shawnee Nation, and he was not happy that the white people were moving into his land, and so he wanted to set up an alliance of Native American tribes to try to stop this settlement from happening. He thought that the settlers were always going to want more land, so even if they gave up this land and moved further west, that the settlers would come and eventually push them out of that land as well, and it was just going to be an ongoing cycle until they had all of the land. So, one night, while the settlers were pushing their way further west, a surprise attack was led by Native Americans on white settlers just east of the Mississippi River. This was known as the Battle of Tippecanoe. Americans ended up defeating the Native American Confederation in this battle and won, but it had a huge impact on what was about to happen, and it led Tecumseh, as well as other fellow Native Americans, to join with the British during what's going to be known as the War of 1812. So, let's get into the War of 1812 and what started this war. The British were supplying guns and ammunition to the Native Americans and encouraging them to fight. They're still bitter and upset and not over the fact that they lost the war, and they want their land back. And so they're going to do everything they can to get it. So at home in America, we had a group of people known as war hawks, and these were young Republicans who wanted to go to war with Great Britain. Some of the more famous ones were John Calhoun and Henry Clay. Henry Clay is often remembered as the most outspoken war hawk. He's the one who had the strongest opinions about going to war. Warhawks had what's known as a strong sense of nationalism. They felt a lot of pride in their country that nobody could beat us, nobody could defeat us, we were the greatest there was, and this whole idea started to grow larger once the war is over. Now, also leading up to the war was Britain, despite Jay's Treaty, was continuing to seize American cargo ships and kidnapping American sailors. That does tend to put a bit of a sour taste in the Americans' mouth when their things are being stolen and their sailors being kidnapped. To continue on with this, Britain decided to begin blockading or blocking the American ports so no ships could get in or out. And finally, America had enough. James Madison, who was elected president after Thomas Jefferson's 2 terms, asked Congress for a declaration of war. And on June of 1812, war was declared by Congress on Great Britain. And just in case you haven't been able to figure this out yet, the War of 1812 is called that because it started in the year 1812. I'm making that clear. Some people mess that up. It's ridiculous. But anyway, being clear with it. Well, Britain was surprised by the war. And they weren't too happy about it because they were in the middle of fighting a war against France. So now they have 2 wars going on. And this is actually going to prove very beneficial to us that the British are divided. But we had some difficulties going into this war. Our Navy only had 16 ships, as again, we know the British had the largest Navy in the world. Our Army was also small and ill-equipped. This goes back to when Thomas Jefferson was president, when he reduced the size of the Army and government spending and did not provide enough supplies, ammunition, and things like that to the soldiers. So they're a small group of people, they're ill-equipped, and they're not prepared to fight a war. This little infographic here kind of shows this preparedness for war. You can see the causes on the left side here that we kind of already talked about. You can see how they voted in the war. It was definitely over 50% on each. And then the preparedness for the war. So we had 12,000 troops. The British and Canadians had 10,000 troops. So we have the advantage there. Mark one up for us. When it comes to naval ships, we had 16. The British had 584. When it came to sailors, we had 4,000, while the British had 140,000. And Marines, who are fighting soldiers on both land and water, we had 1,800, and the British had 31,000. So we were definitely outnumbered in this war on paper. Well, the war is continuing. Battles are fought all over, up through the Great Lakes and down along the coast, and Britain is going to go ahead and finish the war with France. And once that was done, they turned their full attention on us. And that was not a good thing, because before they were divided, we were doing very well. Now their focus is on us. And as soon as they put their focus on us, they marched straight to our capital city of Washington, D.C. Because how else do you tear down a country? By taking over its capital. And once they get to Washington, D.C., they set fire to the White House. And this leads to the famous story of Dolly Madison grabbing that infamous portrait of George Washington before the White House burnt to the ground, saving it for us to still see today. Well, after the White House is burnt to the ground, the British are not done, and they start marching towards Baltimore, Maryland. And what's going to take place there is the Battle of Baltimore on September 13th and 14th. A lot of fighting was going on, cannons being fired. After the rockets had bombarded the harbor, the broad stripes and bright stars were still there. Now you're thinking that may sound familiar. And it is, because this battle, the Battle of Baltimore, is what inspired Francis Scott Key to write a poem. He wrote a poem about this battle using famous words that we know today, because that poem is going to become what's known as the Star-Spangled Banner, or our national anthem that we hear before any sporting event and any major social event that goes on in our country. And so that is where that came from. Francis Scott Key was trapped into a boat, and he could only see, it was dark, and he could only see what was taking place at night, and he could only see by the bursting of the rockets. So through the rockets bursting in the sky, he was able to see the flag was still there and know that the Americans were winning the battle. The battles continue on, and then finally, there's one final battle. Before the Battle of New Orleans actually took place, a peace treaty had been signed between the United States and Great Britain, but it took a very long time for word to spread. In fact, 2 months for word of the treaty to cross the ocean. And so even though the war is officially over, no one in America is really aware of it yet. And so the Battle of New Orleans took place after the peace treaty was signed. Now, this was a very big victory for the Americans. The Americans were able to hold off a British assault, and surprisingly, the U.S. only suffered 7 casualties, while the British had at least 2,000. And the other reason this is important is it makes Andrew Jackson an American hero, a war hero. Everyone's going to know him, and this is going to launch him into his presidency. Well, now that the war is done, President Madison is not really liked, especially up in New England. And New Englanders were not liking the war as it was going on either. And so the peace treaty I talked about earlier was signed in Ghent, in what's present-day Belgium, on December 24th. That's right, Christmas Eve of 1814, just about 2 years after it started. They agreed to go back to the way things were before the war, with borders and everything else. There was a little bit of a dispute over the border between U.S. and Canada, and so they cleared that up to the border that we now know today. Nationalism began to grow throughout the country, and a pride for our country, as we have now defeated the British twice, and manufacturing is encouraged. We are now building our way out of that depression that Thomas Jefferson had put us in. And that is all I got for you guys on James Madison and the War of 1812. Don't forget to continue finish filling out your guided reading notes, which after this video today, you guys should have all the way through number 33 filled out. So we'll continue talking about the developing new nation as we move forward. Have a wonderful rest of your evening, guys, and I can't wait to see you back in class.